brutal war was all of a sudden utterly senseless. Coney's cause was lost, and his strategy was to run and hide. The Lord's Resistance Army, or the LRA, hides in the remote forest that covers so much of that region of the world. Coney has a need for power, however, and thus he still continues his brutal tactics to keep control of his army and the people. Coney feeds off of fear. He's been indicted by the International Criminal Court for over 33 war crimes and crimes against humanity. For myself, all this created a sad but crucial awareness. Africa's longest running war in history, 25 years long, has all been created because of one man named Joseph Coney who is quite literally insane. 4 countries have been terrorized, millions displaced, and over 30,000 children abducted. How on earth could the world have paid nearly no attention to a crisis of this magnitude? Fortunately, though, not everyone had ignored it. In 2003, 3 young guys from California went on a filming adventure to Africa, and what they found changed their lives. They personally saw and lived with over 90% of the northern Ugandan population that had been forced into internal displacement camps like these, where over 1,000 people were dying every week. More important than the statistics, though, are the stories. The 3 Americans documented the story of a young boy named Tony, 11 years old at the time, but living on the streets, with no father and a mother dying of HIV/AIDS. When they came back to America, they created the film and began to show it wherever they could, such as in churches or schools. The story caught on, and the movement had begun. Their first step of action was to provide an opportunity for education to hundreds of students. Although the cost of education is only about $35 in northern Uganda, that's much more than most families can afford. You might be thinking, $35, 6 trips to Starbucks, 2 trips to the bowling alley, maybe even a new pair of shoes. But in that region, it's nearly impossible. Education is desirable, yet it's quite simply just put off because the cost is too great. And that's where Invisible Children and myself come in. Now, families can sponsor a child's education in Uganda. Even clubs called Schools for Schools can team up with a school in Uganda and to provide basic support. Invisible Children and its supporters have also learned a great deal from its many mistakes, however. The key word is this: sustainability. Africa doesn't need to be saved per se, but it could use a sustainable push start in a direction that leads it away from so many of the mistakes and problems that the Western world has forced upon it. Imagine this concept. Why hop on a plane to go to Africa and deliver a pair of shoes to a child in need, rather than using the funds from that plane trip to give that child an education and thus a means to earn the same object? Sustainability is a confusing concept for many of us living in such a privileged area, but it's the most crucial thing for a country struggling to get back up on its feet. Never underestimate the power of education, local leadership, and the embracement of a unique yet beautiful culture. The current situation in the area, though, requires new and very creative thinking. One of the methods proving most effective and crucial is the construction of radio towers in the Central African Republic and the DR Congo, in order to give these remote regions access to communication. Thus, they can know when the rebel army is nearby, and such catastrophes can be stopped. Though we wish that all of these initiatives were free, many of you activists probably know that they most certainly are not. To reach the many goals set in front of us, sometimes the simplest fundraisers can gain the greatest support. We've gone caroling for our cause, made passion fashion, and even held parties with a purpose. A fellow Schools for Schools club at Newport High School nearby even held a breakdancing competition called Back to Reality. In the midst of all this hectic planning and executing, this past spring, I somehow was blessed enough to be chosen to attend an Invisible Children event called the Fourth Estate. I'll tell you right now, the 650 plus attendees of the conference were some of the most inspirational, yet out of their mind, passionate people you'll ever meet. An incredible feeling of being surrounded by creatives, business leaders, movement starters, and so much more probably led to the greatest 4 days of my life. 650 people are insane enough to commit to raising $2.9 million by December 14th. Yet somehow that level of insanity is just what it takes to make the impossible possible and set people into action. Something that became apparent during the Fourth Estate, though, was that it's all so much greater than invisible children. Though I dream of personally moving to Uganda and living within that beautiful community, that certainly wasn't the greatest passion of everyone there, and that's exactly how it should be. We heard from a Muslim who had been frequenting the Middle East ever since the post-September 11th attacks to aid her community there. Some were artists, others were business leaders, nurses, and the list could go on. Yet, some things that stood out about this unique blend of activists was that nearly all of them were under the age of 24, and not a single person there was going to let anyone tell you that the youth of today can't change the world. Furthermore, it was that it's so much greater than a war in Africa. And this is where I'd like to really bring it home. Africa's longest running war in history wouldn't matter if there wasn't something deep inside of us telling us that it's wrong. There's something undeniably wrong with child trafficking, with cancer and corrupt government and bullying and child soldiers. Each person may have their own passions or desires, yet even still, each person simply has to have the courage to do more than just watch. When you find your passion, I hope you just take it and run, because ultimately it's for a God-given and like-minded goal. I learned a great deal from my family at the Fourth Estate, but I think one of the greatest things was that you can prove the universal through the specific. Now, I know I probably bombarded you with a ton of information, and it's hard to keep track, but I think one of the greatest things to learn is about relationships. Invisible Children goes on tour every year, and recently they started bringing Ugandans with them. In this upcoming October, I encourage all of you to come see an Invisible Children screening with a new Ugandan named Kazito who's coming to share his story. But over the past couple of years, I've had the opportunity to keep these volunteer teams in my home and to personally speak with the Ugandans that came. The first one is named Okema James Okulu, and honestly, he's become one of my greatest friends. We have very different lives though. James grew up in northern Uganda, in his hometown of Gulu, in one of the biggest displacement camps that Uganda had seen. Life was rough there. He didn't know his father. His father was killed when he was just a baby, and his mother had been ill for most of his life. James barely could afford school, and then when it stopped, he had to find a way to earn a scholarship. Invisible Children found him, and he became one of Anaka's secondary school's most successful graduates. It was really difficult for me when James had called me recently, and he had told me that his malaria symptoms had come back. This guy was getting along so much better than many of the people in northern Uganda, but yet he still had so many struggles of his own. Furthermore, one of the other stories is of my friend at Chan, Brenda. She had been a little more directly impacted by the Lord's Resistance Army. At the age of only 8 years old, her sister had been abducted. For 7 years, her family sat at home wondering if they would ever see her sister again, if she was even alive. Her sister was in the bush, carrying the supplies of the soldiers and much more. But one day, she managed to escape. When she came back home, the family was rejoicing with the reunion, but things would still never be the same. Her sister had to go to a rehabilitation center, which did help a considerable amount though. Brenda is one of the most quiet and humble women you'll ever meet, but with a heart as courageous as you could possibly imagine. The stories of death and war and despair can never stand a chance to the stories of hope and life that you can find all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cara.